On the evening of July 1st, 1944, at approximately 5:40 p.m., Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt stood in his headquarters at Saint-Germain-en-Laye, a grand chateau that had once belonged to French royalty, located just west of Paris. The evening light filtered through tall windows onto maps covered with markings showing the disposition of forces across Normandy. The room carried the weight of 25 days of deteriorating military situations, of increasingly desperate reports from the front, of mounting casualties that could not be replaced. The telephone rang. On the other end of the line was Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, chief of the German Armed Forces High Command, calling from the Wolfslair, Hitler's fortified headquarters hidden deep in the forests of East Prussia, over 1,000 miles away. Keitel's voice carried the nervous tension of a man who would have to relay whatever answer he received to a leader increasingly detached from military reality. He wanted to know what the situation was in Normandy, what should be done to stabilize the crumbling front. 25 days had passed since the Allied landings on June 6th. The Americans had just captured Cherbourg, securing the deep-water port that would soon allow them to pour supplies into France at an industrial pace. The British were grinding toward Caen, the key city that controlled the road network into the French interior. German casualties were staggering: killed, wounded, missing, captured. The equivalent of multiple divisions had simply ceased to exist as functional military units. Replacements were not coming at anywhere near the rate necessary to sustain defensive operations. The Luftwaffe could not contest the skies. Allied fighter-bombers roamed freely, destroying anything that moved during daylight hours. The front was crumbling, inch by inch, day by day, and everyone who could see the situation clearly understood what it meant. Keitel asked the question that Hitler had been demanding an answer to for weeks. What should we do? Von Rundstedt paused. The line crackled with static. He was 68 years old, the senior field marshal in the German army, a professional soldier who had served the German state for over 50 years under 3 different governments. He had commanded the conquest of Poland in 35 days. He had led Army Group South through Ukraine in 1941, covering 400 miles in 3 months. He had overseen the defense of Western Europe since 1942. He had studied war his entire adult life. He knew exactly what needed to be done, and he knew that saying it would cost him everything. His response was blunt and devastating. End the war immediately. There was no other rational option. The question was not whether Germany would be defeated, but when and at what cost. Every day the fighting continued brought only more pointless death and more destruction. The line went silent. Keitel said nothing. There was nothing to say. Von Rundstedt had spoken the truth that everyone in the German High Command knew, but no one dared articulate. The war was lost. Continuing to fight would only determine how completely Germany would be destroyed before the inevitable surrender. Within days, von Rundstedt was relieved of command. Hitler replaced him with Field Marshal Günther von Kluge, a capable officer who would prove no more able to reverse the situation than von Rundstedt had been. The war would continue for another 10 months. Millions more would die. German cities would be reduced to rubble. The Red Army would fight its way to Berlin, exacting a terrible revenge for the horrors Germany had inflicted on the Soviet Union. And the man who had seen the truth, spoken it plainly, and been removed for his honesty, would watch from retirement as everything he predicted came to pass, exactly as he had foreseen. What happened in those 25 days between D-Day and that telephone call reveals something profound about how military organizations fail when honesty becomes punishable, when the people at the top refuse to listen to those who can actually see reality, when systems are designed to filter truth rather than convey it. The education of a Prussian officer. Karl Rudolf Gerd von Rundstedt was born on December 12, 1875, in Ascherleben, a small town in Prussian Saxony, now part of Saxony-Anhalt. His family had produced officers for the Prussian and German states for generations. The Rundstedts were members of the old nobility, the Uradel, though they held no titles and were not wealthy. Virtually every male Rundstedt since the time of Frederick the Great had served in the Prussian army. Military service was not a career choice for the von Rundstedts. It was a family tradition, an obligation of class, an identity so fundamental that alternatives were never seriously considered. His father, Gerd Arnold Conrad von Rundstedt, had served as a cavalry officer in the Franco-Prussian War, and later rose to the rank of general. His grandfather had fought against Napoleon. The expectation that young Gerd would become an officer was as natural as the expectation that he would learn to read. His education followed the path ordained for Prussian military families: the junior cadet college at Dietz near Koblenz, then the prestigious military academy at Lichterfelde in Berlin. This training prepared him not merely for command, but for a life defined by discipline, duty, and loyalty to the state. Unable to meet the financial requirements of joining a cavalry regiment, the most prestigious branch and traditional choice for aristocratic families, von Rundstedt joined the 83rd Infantry Regiment in March 1892 as a cadet officer at age 16. He progressed steadily through the ranks, demonstrating the methodical competence and attention to detail that would define his career. In 1902, he gained admission to the General Staff Academy, a highly selective institution that trained the Army's intellectual elite. By 1914, when the Great War began, he was a captain serving on the staff of an Army Corps. He spent the entire war in staff positions, never commanding troops in the trenches, but learning the complex art of moving large formations across contested ground, coordinating artillery and infantry, managing the massive logistics that determined whether armies advanced or starved. He participated in the Battle of the Marne and served on both the Western and Eastern fronts in various staff capacities. He assisted in reorganizing the Turkish General Staff, gaining international experience that broadened his understanding of coalition warfare. By 1918, he had been promoted to major and served as Chief of Staff of the 15th Corps in France. He never achieved fame as a frontline commander leading men over the top, but he developed a reputation for methodical competence, clear thinking under pressure, and an ability to remain calm when situations deteriorated, qualities more valuable in staff work than battlefield heroics.
After Germany's defeat in 1918, von Rundstedt stayed in the small professional army that the Versailles Treaty permitted Germany to maintain, just 100,000 men, carefully selected and trained. The Reichswehr was designed to be the nucleus of a future expanded army, and its officer corps consisted of men chosen for their potential to command larger formations should circumstances allow. Von Rundstedt's steady competence ensured his retention. He rose methodically through the ranks during the Weimar Republic. By 1932, he commanded the 3rd Infantry Division. Later that year, he found himself in an uncomfortable position when Chancellor Franz von Papen declared martial law and ordered the army to eject members of the Social Democratic Party from state government offices. Von Rundstedt initially threatened to resign over this politicization of military authority, but ultimately he complied, demonstrating a pattern that would define his career. Uncomfortable with certain orders, but ultimately obedient to the state, regardless of its political character. In February 1934, he joined with General Wilhelm Lieb to block the appointment of Walther von Reichenau, a pro-Nazi general whom Minister of Defense Werner von Blomberg wanted to succeed Kurt von Hammerstein-Eckward as head of the army. Von Rundstedt and other traditional officers were deeply uncomfortable with openly political generals who saw the military as an instrument of Nazi ideology rather than as servants of the state. He also attempted to protect General Werner von Fritsch when false accusations about his personal life were used to force him from office in 1938. Part of Hitler's purge of officers he considered insufficiently loyal. When Hitler came to power in 1933, von Rundstedt was already an established figure in his late 50s, a representative of the old Prussian military aristocracy that predated the Nazi movement by centuries. He never joined the Nazi Party. He never expressed enthusiasm for National Socialist ideology. He viewed Hitler with a mixture of professional distance and aristocratic contempt. Among fellow officers, he privately called Hitler the Bohemian Corporal, a reference to Hitler's modest rank in World War I and his Austrian origins, a term dripping with class-based disdain. Von Rundstedt considered himself a soldier of Germany, not a soldier of any political movement. His loyalty was to the state, to the army, to the traditions of Prussian military service that stretched back centuries. Politicians came and went. Governments rose and fell. The army endured. This perspective, common among the traditional officer corps, contained a fatal flaw. It created men willing to serve whoever controlled the German state, regardless of their methods or goals, as long as the forms of military professionalism were maintained. By 1936, von Rundstedt had reached the rank of General Oberst, Colonel General, and was one of the most senior generals in the German military. In October 1938, increasingly uncomfortable with Hitler's aggressive foreign policy and the growing power of the Nazi Party over military affairs, he retired from active service at age 62. He spent barely a year in retirement before the war he had anticipated began. Early victories: Poland, France, and Russia. When Germany invaded Poland on September 1, 1939, von Rundstedt was recalled to command Army Group South. At 63 years old, he was given responsibility for one of the two main German thrusts into Poland. His chief of staff was General Erich von Manstein, and his chief of operations was Colonel Günther Blumentritt. His principal field commanders included General Johannes Blaskowitz, commanding the 8th Army, General Walther von Reichenau, commanding the 10th Army, and General Wilhelm List, commanding the 14th Army. Von Rundstedt's campaign in Poland was a masterpiece of combined arms warfare. His forces drove from Silesia toward Warsaw with speed and precision, covering 200 miles in 2 weeks. The Poles, fighting with courage but inadequate equipment and facing simultaneous attacks from multiple directions, could not establish coherent defensive lines. German tanks and motorized infantry penetrated deep into Polish territory, encircling and destroying entire Polish armies. Von Rundstedt's forces captured Krakow on September 6th. When Reichenau's overly ambitious attempt to storm Warsaw on September 9th was repelled, and Blaskowitz's exposed northern flank was attacked by the Polish Poznan army in what became the Battle of the Bzura, von Rundstedt calmly redirected forces to contain the crisis. The entire campaign was over in 35 days. Poland ceased to exist as an independent nation, divided between Germany and the Soviet Union. It was a stunning validation of mobile warfare doctrine, and von Rundstedt's reputation as a skilled operational commander was secure. In May 1940, von Rundstedt commanded Army Group A in the invasion of France. He had been quick to recognize the merits of the plan devised by Manstein, a bold thrust through the Ardennes forest, terrain the French considered impassable for large armored formations. With von Rundstedt's support and influence among senior officers, the Manstein Plan was adopted as the basis for the Western Offensive. Von Rundstedt led 7 panzer divisions, 3 motorized divisions, and 35 infantry divisions in the attack. The operation was brilliantly successful. 7 panzer divisions drove through the narrow roads of the Ardennes, emerged behind the main French defensive positions, and created a 50-mile gap in the Allied front. By May 14, 1940, German tanks led by General Guderian had crossed the Meuse River. Within 6 weeks, France had surrendered in the same railway car at Compiègne, where Germany had signed the armistice ending World War I. It was the greatest German military victory since the Wars of Unification in the 19th century. However, von Rundstedt's campaign was not without controversy. When Guderian's panzers raced far ahead of supporting infantry toward Dunkirk, threatening to trap the British Expeditionary Force against the coast, von Rundstedt ordered the tanks to halt and consolidate. He was uncomfortable with the aggressive pace of blitzkrieg operations and concerned about exposing his armor to counterattack. Hitler personally reinforced this halt order on May 24th, creating what became known as the Miracle of Dunkirk. Over 9 days, more than 338,000 Allied troops were evacuated to England, preserving the nucleus of a future army. Von Rundstedt's classical caution, formed by World War I experience, had not adapted to the speed possibilities of armored warfare.
On July 19, 1940, von Rundstedt was promoted to Field Marshal, one of 12 generals elevated to this rank in recognition of the victory over France. He participated in planning for Operation Sea Lion, the proposed invasion of Britain. When this operation was indefinitely postponed in autumn 1940 due to the Luftwaffe's failure to achieve air superiority, von Rundstedt took control of occupation forces and was given responsibility for developing coastal defenses in Holland, Belgium, and France. In June 1941, von Rundstedt participated in Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. He commanded Army Group South, consisting of 52 infantry divisions and 5 panzer divisions, driving into Ukraine. His forces covered 400 miles in 3 months, capturing Kiev in September 1941 in an encirclement that trapped over 665,000 Soviet soldiers, one of the largest battles of annihilation in military history. But von Rundstedt also saw something that the ideologues in Berlin refused to acknowledge. The Soviet Union was not collapsing as Hitler had predicted. The Red Army, despite suffering catastrophic losses that would have destroyed any other military force, continued to fight. New divisions appeared to replace those destroyed. Soviet industry, evacuated beyond the Ural Mountains, continued to produce tanks, aircraft, and artillery. The seemingly endless spaces of Russia absorbed German advances without breaking Soviet will to resist. The winter of 1941 brought the German advance to a halt. In November, von Rundstedt's forces captured Rostov-on-Don after bitter fighting, but Soviet resistance stiffened. On November 28th, the Soviets launched a powerful counteroffensive. On November 29th, von Rundstedt authorized Field Marshal Ewald von Kleist to withdraw from Rostov and establish a defensive line on the Mias River, 70 kilometers to the west. The position was untenable, and retreat was the only militarily sound option. When Hitler heard of this withdrawal on November 29th, he was furious. He had ordered that all positions be held at all costs, that no retreats be permitted under any circumstances. Hitler insisted that Rostov be retaken immediately. Von Rundstedt replied by standing firm on his decision and adding that if confidence in his leadership no longer existed, he requested to be replaced by someone who enjoyed the necessary confidence of the Supreme Command. Hitler took him at his word. On December 1, 1941, Hitler dismissed von Rundstedt, replacing him with Reichenau. It was the first significant dismissal of a senior German commander in World War II. The new commander immediately saw that von Rundstedt was right and succeeded in persuading Hitler, through intermediaries, to authorize the withdrawal. Hitler eventually visited von Rundstedt's former headquarters, acknowledged that the withdrawal had been necessary, and suggested that von Rundstedt take leave and return to service later. But the lesson was clear. Commanders who told Hitler unwelcome truths, no matter how militarily sound, would be removed. Commander-in-Chief West, the impossible task. In March 1942, Hitler recalled von Rundstedt and appointed him Oberbefehlshaber West, Commander-in-Chief West. His mission was to prepare the defense of the Atlantic coast from Norway to Spain, nearly 3,000 miles of coastline. The Allies would eventually invade Western Europe. Everyone knew this. The questions were where, when, and whether Germany could defeat the invasion when it came. Von Rundstedt's situation was profoundly difficult from the beginning. He commanded dozens of divisions on paper, but many existed only nominally. Some divisions consisted primarily of older men, conscripted in their 40s after younger men had been killed or captured on the Eastern Front. Other divisions contained Osttruppen, soldiers from the conquered territories of the Soviet Union who had been coerced or persuaded into German service. Their reliability was questionable at best, their equipment often obsolete, their training inadequate. The Luftwaffe had lost air superiority over Western Europe. Allied bombers struck German industry by day and by night, and the fighter forces attempting to stop them were being ground down in a battle of attrition they could not win. German aircraft production could not pace with losses. Experienced pilots were dying faster than they could be replaced. The skies over France were increasingly dominated by Allied aircraft. The Kriegsmarine had lost the Battle of the Atlantic. U-boats still sailed, but they were being sunk faster than they could be built. Allied convoy routes bringing American men and materiel to Britain flowed freely. Every month, more American divisions arrived in England. Every month, more tanks, trucks, artillery pieces, and aircraft accumulated for the inevitable invasion. Von Rundstedt was being asked to defend a continent with an army that was already bleeding to death in the east, against enemies who controlled the sea and the sky, with no prospect of significant reinforcement and no margin for error. He understood the mathematics of the situation. He understood that Germany's strategic position was deteriorating every month. But he was a soldier, and soldiers do their duty. He would prepare the best defense he could and hope that circumstances might somehow change. The strategic debate, Rommel versus von Rundstedt. The fundamental problem facing German defensive planning was resources. Germany did not have enough men, tanks, aircraft, and fuel to defend everywhere at once. The Atlantic coast stretched for thousands of miles. The Allies, with complete naval superiority, could land almost anywhere. Difficult decisions had to be made about priorities, about where to concentrate forces while accepting risk elsewhere. This is where the conflict between von Rundstedt and Field Marshal Erwin Rommel began. Rommel had been appointed to command Army Group B under von Rundstedt in November 1943, responsible for the defense of northern France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. The two men had fundamentally different philosophies about how to defeat an invasion. Von Rundstedt favored holding panzer divisions in reserve, positioned well back from the coast, perhaps 100 miles inland, perhaps more. His reasoning reflects classical military doctrine refined over centuries. An attacker moving by sea could strike anywhere along a vast coastline. A defender could not be strong everywhere simultaneously. Therefore, sound strategy required holding mobile reserves at central positions, waiting until the enemy committed himself to a specific location, then rapidly concentrating superior force at that point for a decisive counterattack. Trying to spread armor thinly along the entire coast would make it too weak everywhere to be decisive anywhere. The panzer reserves would be the hammer that would smash the Allied beachhead once its location was confirmed. Rommel disagreed completely, and his disagreement was based on hard experience. He had fought the British and Americans in North Africa. He had watched his supply convoys burn on the desert roads under constant air attack. He had seen his tanks destroyed by Allied fighter bombers before they could reach the battlefield. He had experienced the devastating effects of naval gunfire on coastal positions. Unlike von Rundstedt, whose experience was primarily on the Eastern Front, where the Luftwaffe had initially maintained air superiority, Rommel understood what total Allied air dominance meant for mobile operations.
Rommel believed that once the Allies established themselves ashore, German armor would never reach the coast. Allied fighter bombers would destroy panzer columns on the roads during their approach. Allied naval guns would shatter any counterattack that got close to the beaches. Moving large formations in daylight would be suicidal. Moving them at night would be too slow. The only chance, Rommel argued, was to defeat the invasion in the first hours, on the beaches themselves, before the Allies could consolidate their position and bring their overwhelming air and naval power fully to bear. Every tank, every gun, every soldier had to be as close to the water as possible. The invasion had to be stopped at the waterline, or it would not be stopped at all. Rommel famously told his staff that the first 24 hours would be decisive for both the Allies and Germany. It would be the longest day. If German forces could not throw the invaders back into the sea in those first hours before Allied strength accumulated, the battle would be lost. Both men had valid points, grounded in experience and military theory. Von Rundstedt's classical approach of mobile reserves and concentrated counterattack had worked throughout military history. Rommel's assessment of Allied air and naval power was entirely accurate based on his North African experience. A true operational artist might have found a synthesis, holding some armor forward to contest the beaches immediately, maintaining other formations further back for counterattack, creating a layered defense with flexibility. Instead, Hitler characteristically chose the worst possible option. He compromised by keeping direct personal control over key panzer divisions. The Panzer Layered Division and the 12th SS Panzer Division could not move without Hitler's personal authorization transmitted through the Armed Forces High Command from wherever Hitler happened to be, often hundreds or thousands of miles from the front. This decision removed strategic flexibility from the commanders who could actually see what was happening. It meant that when the invasion came, the men on the ground in Normandy would have to request permission from a man in Bavaria or East Prussia who could see nothing but colored pins on a map, who relied on reports that were hours old by the time they reached him, who made decisions based on intuition and political considerations rather than tactical reality. It guaranteed delays. It guaranteed confusion. It guaranteed that the critical hours after the landing would be wasted waiting for authorization that might or might not come, and that when it came, might be too late to matter. June 6, 1944, the day everything changed. The Allied invasion began in the pre-dawn hours of June 6, 1944. At 12:15 a.m., the first Pathfinder teams from the American 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions parachuted into the darkness over Normandy, marking drop zones for the main airborne assault. Between 1 and 3 a.m., more than 13,000 American paratroopers jumped over the Cotentin Peninsula, seizing bridges and road junctions, creating chaos in German rear areas. Allied British airborne forces landed by parachute and glider near Caen, capturing key bridges over the Orne River and Caen Canal. At approximately 6:30 in the morning, reports began filtering into von Rundstedt's headquarters at Saint-Germain-des-Lanes. Paratroopers had been landing for hours. Naval bombardment had begun before dawn, with battleships and cruisers pounding German coastal fortifications with shells weighing up to a ton. The scope of the attack was immediately clear. This was not a raid. This was not a small-scale probing attack. This was the invasion. The Allies landed on 5 beaches across a 50-mile stretch of the Normandy coast. At Utah Beach, the American 4th Infantry Division came ashore with relatively light casualties, landing slightly off target but quickly pushing inland. At Omaha Beach, the American 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions encountered the 352nd Infantry Division and suffered terribly. Over 2,000 killed and wounded in the first hours, the invasion's bloodiest sector. At Gold, Juno, and Sword Beaches, British and Canadian forces established themselves against determined but ultimately insufficient resistance. By the end of June 6th, approximately 156,000 Allied soldiers had landed in Normandy, 73,000 Americans and 83,000 British and Canadians. Nearly 7,000 ships delivered them, the largest naval armada ever assembled. Approximately 11,590 aircraft provided support, maintaining complete control of the skies over the invasion area. Not a single German aircraft appeared over the beaches during the crucial daylight hours. Von Rundstedt learned the full scale of the invasion around 6:30 a.m. when comprehensive reports began arriving from coastal defense units.
He immediately requested release of the Panzer reserves. The situation was exactly what he and Rommel had been planning for. The enemy had committed himself. His location was now known. German armor needed to move immediately to strike the beachheads before they could be reinforced and consolidated. Every hour of delay allowed the Allies to land more men, more tanks, more artillery. Every hour allowed them to strengthen defensive positions and extend their perimeter. Every hour mattered critically. The request went to Hitler's headquarters at the Berghof in Bavaria, where he had been staying since late spring. Hitler had stayed up until 2 or 3 in the morning watching newsreels with Joseph Goebbels and Eva Braun. His personal physician had given him a sleeping pill to treat his chronic insomnia, which had grown worse as the war situation deteriorated. His staff, terrified of his increasingly violent rages, refused to wake him. The Führer had left explicit orders not to be disturbed under any circumstances. Even Albert Speer, the armaments minister, who arrived at the Berghof around 10 o'clock in the morning, found Hitler still asleep. The panzers sat motionless, their engines cold, their crews waiting for orders that did not come. Hours passed. The Allies consolidated their positions. More men poured ashore. More equipment was unloaded. The beachheads began linking up. The window for a decisive counterattack began to close. When Hitler finally woke around noon, he still hesitated. He remained convinced that Normandy was a diversion, that the real invasion would come at Pas-de-Calais, the narrowest point of the English Channel, only 21 miles from Dover to the French coast. Allied deception operations, codenamed Fortitude, had convinced German intelligence that a massive army group under General George Patton was assembling in southeast England, preparing to strike at Calais. Operation Fortitude was one of the most successful deception operations in military history. The Allies had created an entirely fictional 1st United States Army Group, FUSAG, with complete fake radio traffic, dummy landing craft visible to German reconnaissance aircraft, and false reports fed through double agents. Patton, whom the Germans considered their most dangerous opponent, was publicly associated with this phantom army. German intelligence had photographed the dummy installations. Double agents had confirmed the preparations. Hitler and many in the German high command were utterly convinced that Normandy was merely a preliminary operation designed to draw German reserves away from the real objective at Calais.